put yourself on speaker view, or put your screen on speaker view once he gets started so that you can focus on him. I do also want to mention that this is being recorded. Dr. Curlin said that was fine for us to do. And so if you have friends or family who are not able to be on live with us this morning, probably by tomorrow, possibly by later today, Thomas will get this recording onto the church's YouTube page, and folks can go there after and listen to the whole class after this morning. When we first started exploring the idea about having a Sunday school class based on this book, one person who will remain anonymous said, "What a fantastic idea." She thought this was, and she'd read the book before, but had never imagined us talking about it at church. And I have said since I was first introduced to this book, which I'm not sure how many years ago that was, that I thought this was the kind of thing we really should be talking about together at church. That as people of faith, we have gifts, I think, and language to bring to these conversations about being ill and about death and dying, and that church is a really important place for us to be having these kinds of conversations together. And so I watched again this morning the Frontline special with Dr. Gawande that goes through a lot of the pieces of the book. And in that, there's a line that says, "We live for something bigger than ourselves." And I think that's part of why this conversation is so important for us as people of faith, because we do really believe that that is true. So I'm excited about this series. It's I think this is not a topic where we're all just woo-hoo about, right? I think it makes us think about our own stories and our own experiences and people we know and love who have died. But these are such important and I think really holy conversations for us to be having as people of faith. So I'm going to invite you to pray with me, and then I'm going to introduce Dr. Curlin, and then we'll begin together. So let us pray. Oh God, in whom we live and move and have our being, we give you thanks this morning for this opportunity we have to gather in many different places as your people, as your children, to explore and to discuss important and significant, but we also know heavy things as we talk about not only how we live for you, but how we die in your care. And I pray your blessing upon this time this morning. We give you thanks for Dr. Curlin and his willingness to be with us and to share from his experience and his expertise. And we pray that this journey of exploration and study and learning together will be a blessing for us, and we hope also a blessing for others, for we know that these issues that we explore are critically important for all of us and all those who we love. I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
It is my good pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Farr Curlin. And I always like to joke that the Rumple Memorial Presbyterian Church is a really long title, but I think his title is a far longer than the name of our church. He is the Josiah C. Trent Professor of Medical Humanities in the Trent Center for Bioethics, Humanities, and the History of Medicine. And he is the co-director of the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative at Duke Divinity School. He is a medical doctor trained in internal medicine and experience in palliative medicine, but much of his expertise is the intersection of theology, medicine, and culture. So seems to me such a perfect person to be able to help us dig into this issue on this first day. He does work at Duke, but he is a graduate of UNC Medical School. It seems like there are many folks in North Carolina that have those sort of dual loyalties. So when I was looking at his bio, I thought, well, he works at Duke, but he went to Carolina. But I think there's many who can relate to that. Before coming to Duke in 2014, he was at the University of Chicago, exploring some very similar things there. So we welcome you, Dr. Curlin. Thank you for being with us. And we're looking forward to all that you have to share with us this morning.
Thank you, Kathy. My goal is to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes to lay out some ideas for you about my thoughts and reflections after years of paying attention to Christian tradition regarding suffering and illness and living up against our death, um, and to propose sort of general rules of thumb that I hope will be helpful regarding how to face our own death or the death of a loved one as a faithful disciple of Jesus. In a moment, Kathy's going to share, and Kathy, if you end up not being able to do this, we'll figure it out later. It's not critical that you have this handout right now, but she's going to share a handout, one page, and then maybe later in the hour we'll hand a second one page handout. But I'll just say as introduction that I found Atul Gawande's book very helpful in diagnosing some of the problems with the way Americans make use of medicine and the way we organize the care of those who are growing more frail and debilitated toward the end of life. And I think what Gawande shows pretty powerfully is that Americans are living in the later stage of their life and dying in ways that seem at odds with what they say is important to them and what they say what they would really choose if they could. Where Gawande's book, I think, is not as helpful is in a constructive account of what it is for us to live well in the face of death. He sort of shies away from that. And I think that makes sense given that Gawande is himself a sort of agnostic and doesn't really have is not persuaded of a spiritual horizon for this life. And so he ends up kind of proposing that we should adjust things so people die more in the way they want to die. As Christians, dying in the way we want to die is not a great priority, frankly. There's nothing in our tradition that says we should have what we want. More, we should want what is good for us. We should want God, and we should want all that God has for us in creation, in one another, and in the life that we're called to live, that we have a vocation toward. And so I want us to think about that sort of in a way that Atul Gawande couldn't, given where he was starting, but from the standpoint of the Christian faith about how we face our own death. And I'd say that the first rule of thumb, or the first thing I want to just emphasize, is that your vocation as a beloved child of God and a disciple of Jesus Christ continues as you face your death. Your vocation continues. It is frequently suggested in the way we respond to terminal illness or grave decline in our health as if it's all over and that there's nothing left to do except kind of get rid of suffering and wrap things up. But that's never true for God's children. Our vocation continues until the end. And maybe our vocation gets really simplified and becomes things like reconcile with our children or with our brothers and sisters, or with our neighbors, confess our sins, give praise to God, give thanks, practice gratitude, be patient in the face of suffering. But the vocation continues. And practically speaking, then, the challenge for us is to make use of medicine to preserve and restore the measure of health that can reasonably be preserved and restored in our situation. So the general pattern in our culture, including our medical culture, is when someone gets sick, we do this in the church as well. We kind of give people over to the medical system with the assumption that what you got to do is do everything you can to beat this illness. And that departs pretty significantly from the way Christians have thought about our responsibilities when we face illness. And that the Christian tradition speaks more of kind of making use of medicine in a way that aligns with, rather than getting in the way of, our vocation. So I often share this quotation from St. Basil, who thought a lot about health and medicine and was the founder of what really the first charity hospital, the first hospital that we now take for granted. He writes, each of the arts is bestowed on us by God to supply for the infirmity of nature. Subjected to these diseases, we were also provided the help that is given the sick, in some measure at least, by the medical art. Yet whatever involves contrivance and fuss and involves much commotion and, as it were, turns our whole life into one long provision for the flesh should be avoided. Now, this is a theme. If you look at the writings of the church fathers, this is a strong theme that Christians had the freedom to make use of what the church fathers called secular medicine, which we would just call scientific medicine. Um, we have the freedom to use it and should be grateful for it as a gift of God. Like Basil says, the gift of agriculture. Because we are in our mortal condition subject to getting hungry, God has given us agriculture so we can learn we can cultivate food. He says, similarly, as we are prone to get sick and suffer injury, God has given us the arts of scientific medicine to help heal us. But we should never make use of those in a way that makes our whole life caught up in just trying to be alive, stay alive, or get better. And that's a real temptation, it seems to me, watching folks get sick. There's a kind of desperation that can set in that really doesn't fit with Christian faith. And people can let their entire life become entirely absorbed by worry about their health and by doing everything possible to preserve it. Now, we can talk about details. I'll look forward to questions you guys have in the latter half of the hour we have together. A second rule of thumb, though, so the first again here is remember your vocation continues even when you're dying, right up to the end. The second is that Christians seek not a good death in the world's terms today, but we seek to die well or faithfully. There grew up in the Middle Ages something called the ars moriendi, which just means the art of dying or dying well or dying faithfully. These are all be synonyms. And what happened was during the time of the plague, the bubonic plague in Europe, people were dying at such great numbers and so quickly that the clergy were utterly overwhelmed. They couldn't carry out the sacraments and the practices of attending to those who are dying in the way that they had been able to when there weren't so many people dying. And so they're overwhelmed. And so the church allowed and ended up blessing the development of a kind of lay literature, a simple literature that was almost like comic books, but it was prints that displayed, because obviously most of the population was illiterate, that gave people a guide for how to die well. And these prints showed images of things like temptation, temptation to fear, temptation to avarice, to kind of holding on to this life, temptation to resentment, temptation to a number of temptations, and then also showed kind of steps one could take to prepare for dying by praying. It gave roles for the people around them, how to surround a person who's dying, to pray over them, to bless them, to anoint them, and so on. And this is important because this distinction between seeking a good death and dying well is important because the impulse, as I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, for a good death in our culture comes defined as a good death is one that I want, and it's one that has minimal suffering. So it kind of, the contemporary vision of a good death is one that reifies these powerful values of modern life that are not really values of the Christian faith and of the Christian people over the centuries. And that is that we get what we want, we get to choose to the end, we stay in control, and that we have as little suffering as possible. We see this in the world of medicine, an emphasis on minimizing suffering and maximizing quality of life. We see it in an emphasis on patients dying as they choose and staying in control. But if you look at the writings of the church over the centuries, they're much more likely to point to exemplars of those who have suffered well. And that doesn't mean to valorize suffering. It doesn't mean that you forego relief of suffering, by no means, but it means that the challenge for Christians is to be patient in the face of the reality of our moral condition and the fact that suffering is intrinsic to human life, and that we are all going to break down and die. Um, how do we do that well? How do we go through that process well and live in the face of our impending death well? That should be the posture of our hearts, not trying to find a good death so that we can, you know, we can kind of wrap our lives up in a way that um, is satisfying to us. And of course, essential to this is to remember that we hope in the resurrection. Um, you can look back at 1 Corinthians 15. I won't do that now just because of the interest of time, but this glorious passage on the hope that Christians have of the resurrection. Paul, of course, says, if we are not going to be raised, we are of all people most to be pitied. If this is not true, this gathering is a futile gathering. This church is a futile church, but we proclaim and believe that it is true, that the witness of the church is that we will be raised. And that changes everything in how we face our death. Um, so a third, that's a second one. Christians seek not a good death, but to die well. A third rule of thumb here is beware the culture in which the only reasonable way to respond to suffering is to get rid of it. And I spoke to this a little bit a moment ago, but suffering, Christians have never, well, I mean, the church is big. You can find a Christian who's done everything, but the church has not taught that suffering is good in itself. In fact, when you read the church fathers about this, they were very keen to make sure that they did not talk about suffering and illness and death in a way that suggested that God was the author of these. But clearly, God does allow these. And so they talked about how God redeems suffering, illness, injury, debility, death. He redeems those for God's good purposes in our lives. And it's just a fact that that Christians have found and borne witness that often some of the most important gifts of God's grace and transformation and healing and growth of faith in their life happens through suffering. It's a distinctive occasion of God's good gifts, which all that means that the church does not look at debility and weakness as the world sees them. The world increasingly sees these things as just things that are to be despised and to be avoided and to be escaped if necessary. Our vocation is often to instead, in contrast to this, to embrace our dependency and graciously receive care from others. This is, as a practitioner of hospice and palliative medicine, I'll say one of the beautiful ways that mature Christians display the difference, that they bear witness to the freedom and the life that Christ brings, is when they patiently suffer and allow people to care for them. By contrast, there are Christians who frequently, I see this, and certainly folks who are not Christians, who are impatient and don't want people to visit, don't want to be dependent, sort of they're neuralgically responding to the fact that they need help, they need to be loved and cared for. And that's a display, it seems to me, of a kind of well, certainly an impatience, but also an unwillingness to turn and receive from God and from one's brothers and sisters who are those through whom Christ comes to us, the care that God offers us. Another language that's been used by some Christian theologians in the past is that the challenge is when we're sick to assume our illness and our mortality as Christians, to assume them, not meaning take them for granted, but to take them on, to recognize these are not just things to actually run away from. The fact that I have cancer is not something I have to just desperately flee from as if it's this horrible foreign thing to me and it's going to completely wreck my life. But rather, Lord, I've got cancer. Where are you in this? What do you have for me in this experience? That becomes the challenge. And it's not an easy challenge. As I'm sure many of you know, and certainly I have seen and taken care of many people who are dying. A fourth A fourth rule of thumb here is I would encourage you guys to embrace the church's language and the church's norms for medical ethics. You don't see those in Gawande's book, of course, Gawande not being a Christian. But, and in fact, one of the things that's sobering to me about Gawande's where he lands is that he ends up supporting what has come to be called medical aid in dying or physician aid in dying, what I think is more precisely called physician assisted suicide or voluntary euthanasia. But those are practices that the church has from the very beginning said are incompatible with Christian discipleship, with Christian faithfulness. So a simple way to put these norms, the church's norms, are: first, health should not be intentionally destroyed. Health is a gift. That does not mean we have to do everything possible to preserve our health. Whether and to what extent you should pursue health requires discernment, and it requires you paying attention to your vocation before God. The second principle, though, from Christian tradition is that life is of intrinsic and inestimable value. That does not mean that life is of infinite value, a common misunderstanding of Christian teaching. The church nowhere teaches that we have to do everything possible to stay alive. And I think philosophically can be shown that life cannot be of infinite value. That becomes a principle that becomes unworkable and self-contradictory. But life is of intrinsic value, which means that we don't look at each other and weigh up the dignity or the worth of each other's lives based on what we're capable of doing, what we're capable of choosing, the extent to which we have our suffering relieved, and so on. We don't, as Christians, judge life's value based on life's productivity or life's even satisfaction in terms of pleasures and achieving one's goals. Rather, we weigh up people's value based on the fact that we're made in God's image and that Jesus has, in the incarnation, become one of us and dignified all of human life. And then we have to acknowledge the inevitable tension between relieving symptoms and being able to engage actively in dying well. This, I think, is a really big issue that Christians have only just begun to grapple with, and it's going to become increasingly it's going to becoming an increasingly difficult issue. Our culture is really committed to the notion that suffering is just bad. You got to get rid of suffering, and choice is just good. You got to maximize choice. You put those two together, and we can have a tendency culturally to just push when anybody is suffering to get rid of the suffering no matter what. All the medications that get rid of difficult symptoms, whether it's pain or being breathless or being delirious or having nausea, all of them suppress our consciousness to some extent as side effects. And Christians have the freedom to treat those symptoms aggressively and well, but it seems to me that our temptation is to just do so in a way that forgets that continuing our vocation insofar as possible is a real important good. And I think the challenge for Christians is often how to relieve pain and breathlessness and so on, other symptoms, in a way that's fitting without just intentionally trying to knock somebody out. And finally, a Christian norm in terms of ethics is we should never aim at our own or another's death, right? We don't ever seek to get dead ourselves or our loved ones. We can accept death as a side effect of efforts that intend to relieve really difficult symptoms. The church has always permitted this. So if someone's gasping for breath and they're dying from advanced lung cancer, I think it's frequently, and I think there's lots of warrant from this in the tradition, frequently fitting for us to push morphine until they're not struggling to breathe, even knowing that as a result, they'll probably not wake up. They'll probably be sedated until they die from what we call respiratory failure, from not being able to breathe. That's not a problem, but we should never aim to accelerate the dying, make that our goal. There's this norm that grew up In the Middle Ages, St. Thomas Aquinas is credited with having its probably most precise formulation. The norm is called the rule of double effect. And it basically boils down to the idea that we should intend in our actions, we should set out as a goal in our actions only to do the good. And uh, and only to accept harms that we can foresee that are going to result from our action, whether it's sedating to unconsciousness or hastening death or whatever the harm might be. We should only accept those when we have proportionate reason to do so. And I think a simple way for you guys to remember this distinction is that medicine is to help patients who are dying, not to help patients to die. And that may seem like an academic distinction, but it really becomes quite practical in the fray of caring for those who are dying. And I encourage you not to, for your own care or for your loved ones, don't ask medicine to help patients to die. Don't ask the doctors, this is going on too long. Can you speed it up? Rather, make your requests and your focus, what you appeal to from medicine, to help those who are dying. Can you help? He seems to be out of breath. Can you help that breathlessness? He seems to be in pain. Can you help that pain? She's vomiting, every 6 hours. Can you do something to relieve the vomiting? And if those efforts result in hastening death, for Christians, so be it. Our hope is not to stay alive forever. We know that's not going to happen. Our hope is not to get dead as soon as possible so we can escape this suffering. Our hope is in Christ, who will raise us, who's the firstborn of the dead, and through whom we'll be raised from the dead. Another little way of putting this is that you'll hear some people talk about last resort options in medicine, and that's options like assisted suicide and euthanasia. They're not good options. You will face, some of you, the question doctors will offer you. You could stop eating and drinking, and in order to hasten your death. I don't think that can be justified in the Christian faith. Certainly, there are times to stop eating because eating makes you feel bad, or eating doesn't really satisfy you, or it's not doing any good. In that case, you have no obligation to eat. But eating as a strategy to kill yourself is likewise not really justifiable within the Christian tradition. So why don't I stop there and see what questions or comments you guys might have.
I've had one question that came in the chat already, which I thought was a very thoughtful question. And so I'll just go ahead and share that with you first.
Please.
And then invite others to either voice those after this or send them in the chat. And this person said, should choosing a physician be based on their scientific ability, their theology, or some combination of both?
Yeah, I think you have a threshold, in my judgment, you have a threshold criterion in way, and it's not explicitly theological, but I think you should choose a physician based on the physician's commitment to and demonstrated practice of attending to patients who are sick, seeking to preserve their health, and showing that they're good at it. So part of that is that they're not going to be good at it if they're not up to date on the science of medicine. If they don't know the science, if they don't respect the data, if they're not up to date on the therapeutic modalities that are available, they're not going to be very good at preserving and restoring health. But likewise, if they don't accept the traditional boundaries of medicine, that medicine is a healing art, not a killing art, that the goal of medicine is not just to pursue the state of affairs that a person might want, but rather is to practice this art wisely in the specific context of each patient, what their health requires and what their vocation requires and what they're willing to do, then that physician to me is not one to be trusted when you're deathly ill. And most docs meet those threshold criteria. They're not, but I think in that respect, it's definitely a level of science and at least the theological, philosophical commitment of healing, not killing, is how you should choose a doctor. it's a bonus if you find a doctor who is wise and is learned as a Christian. That seems to me a real bonus because she or he, one hopes, will be characterized by being able to seek patients' health in a way that has in mind this broader horizon of reality that we attest to, and will not be as likely to treat you as a cog in the machine, as a just a kind of widget moving through his or her industrial practice, which is so often, of course, a problem. What else?
I've got another question here in the chat that says, how does one die well with Alzheimer's? Oops, it just disappeared. And how can friends and relatives help dying well in cases like COVID-19 when visitation is not allowed? So I guess that's a double question about Alzheimer's and about this current situation with COVID.
Yeah, I mean, the COVID one I'll address first because it's obviously been quite present. You know, I have argued, I've colleagues who've argued more publicly about this, I think rightly, that that COVID-19 should not, it's unwise as a form of policy for us to cut people off from their clergy and from their core family, even who have COVID-19, particularly when they're dying. I recognize that we have to exercise care, particularly with assisted living facilities and nursing facilities where COVID can go like wildfire and kill large proportions of the patients. And that's the real challenge. But it seems to me that once someone's sick and they move to the hospital, we should accept as a reasonable risk the risk of people being able to visit them. And clergy should be seen as essential personnel in the language of the hospital. And so I put them insofar as the laws, and if you're not allowed, you know, just express your concern that it's important to be able to visit them, pray over them. And of course, you're going to wear protective equipment, but that I think is important. In terms of Alzheimer's, there's a wonderful book I would commend to you by my colleague and friend John Swinton, Swinton, and it's called I think it's called Dementia: Living in the Memories of God. And I can't fully encapsulate his beautiful, I think, argument here. It comes from a lot of experience. He was a practicing nurse for many years before becoming a theologian, and is paying close attention to how to dementia as an experience. But he emphasizes that, you know, for Christians, it's not so important that we remember who we are and whose we are, as it is important that God remembers us. And then he talks about how to die well with Alzheimer's is really outside of that person's hands. It's really a question for the community of how do we care well for the one with Alzheimer's. And it seems to me that care is going to be marked by patience, a lot of basic attention, a lot of time, and a lot of remembering to that person, whether they can consciously process it or not, but reminding them bodily that they still belong to God's people. They still belong to God. And one of the things that's interesting with dementia, a number of studies have found this, is that people who have lost the ability to talk, who seem to have lost all orientation to their world, they can bodily remember things like kneeling, or maybe not kneeling, but sort of bowing their head, receiving the sacraments. Sometimes we'll start to so if people start in a group saying the Lord's Prayer, they can join in and say the Lord's Prayer. So there's a way for the church to die well, to sort of care well for them, and then it's not that they exercise dying well so much as they die enfolded in the people of God.
That's one of the questions that came in from one of our future presenters, one of the physicians in the congregation, he was asking this: does this question speak of surrogate decision making? He was sort of speaking to these Alzheimer's patients. Who should the surrogate decision maker be? Does he or she necessarily reflect the desires of the patient? That sort of, I think that connects well.
Yeah, and that's a great question. That's one of those wonderfully, really concrete and practical questions that many of you will face, which is, okay, what, I'm going to address this in a couple of ways. What should you do now before you have Alzheimer's disease, so that decisions are made as wisely as possible when you do have Alzheimer's disease, potentially, or you've had a stroke, or for some other reason, God forbid, you've lost your capacity to make decisions for yourself. There are three roughly different ways that this is managed in medicine today. One is with a living will. So you sit down, sometimes with an attorney, but you can actually do this on your own. You write out using a form, what's important to you and what you would or wouldn't want done. Living wills are not bad. They're not terribly useful in most cases because they tend to be quite non-specific. They tend to say things like, if I have a irreversible brain condition and can no longer be conscious, I would not want to be kept interminably on life support, something like that. And most people just never end up in that particular situation. So they are, I think what they're insofar as they're useful primarily as a structure whereby you talk to your children or other loved ones, friends, whoever's going to be probably around you, helping to make decisions for you, and you express your wishes. So living wills are a great way for people to kind of, as a family, have hard conversations. And those conversations are really what need to happen. The next strategy, which I think is far to be preferred to the living will, is to have a durable power of attorney for healthcare. You do need, actually, I can't remember if you have to have an attorney, or I think maybe you don't have to have an attorney, but this is a legal document. And you basically specify someone you trust to make decisions for you when you can't make decisions for yourself. It's far to be preferred because you can't anticipate what's going to happen to you. You just can't look ahead and anticipate what's going to happen. And I'll say, as a physician, very often people find themselves in situations where it's not really clear how, even looking at their living will, what they would want here. So someone says, I wouldn't want to be kept alive on a breathing tube, and they're 85 but pretty functional. They're playing golf twice a week, or enjoying hanging out with friends twice a week, and then they get pneumonia and they're gasping for breath and they can't breathe on their own. Should they be put on the ventilator? That's a difficult decision that I would say, in most cases, I'd say, yeah, put them on the ventilator for a few days. And let's see if they respond. And if they can't get off the ventilator, of course, we can withdraw it. You need that kind of flexibility. So a durable power of attorney for healthcare is what I would recommend. You find someone you trust, and you should probably have a backup. And then the key is talk to them and involve other people who are going to be around you. So for example, let's say you got 4 kids. One of them is a nurse and has got a good head on her shoulders. And so you think she should really be the durable power. She should be the first decision maker. I'll make her a durable power of attorney for healthcare. Talk to the other kids as well, with her in the room when you do that, and explain your wishes and say, I'm trusting Cindy to make the decisions, and I encourage all of you guys to support her. She may face a difficult decision, and give them the kind of blessing and freedom to make their best judgments and to reflect to them your values, what you're concerned about, what you're worried about, what's important to you. Bless them to make decisions as best they can, because the worst thing that happens is someone has durable power of attorney for healthcare and they tell the one kid, and then you get sick and you get in one of those awkward situations, and that one kid is hearing from the other kids and they're going, what the heck are you doing? You trying to kill dad? Or, well, dad told me he would never want this. Oh, I don't believe that. It can blow a family up in a way that they never recover from. So have the conversation with all the key people and then appoint those to make decisions. I'd recommend that. The third thing that's used and is helpful for some folks is what's called PULST or MOLST or MOST. Basically, these are physician orders or medical orders for life-sustaining treatment. This has grown in popularity across the United States. North Carolina has forms of these orders. This is helpful if you live in a nursing home at some point. And you can also have this in an assisted living, but where you're not sure that people are going to follow the restrictions that you want to be followed, you can have a medical order put on your chart so that, let's say you've decided, I do not want dialysis. My kidneys are getting weaker and weaker. I don't want dialysis, period. You can have that on an order so that no matter where you go, that will be respected. No one's going to put you on dialysis. But again, durable power of attorney for healthcare is the key.
There's a couple other questions there in the chat. So I'm just going to take them in the order that they come in. And the first one said, do you feel that medical students are being trained enough to truly listen well to their patients?
You know, they're trying. Medical schools are trying. Medical educators are trying. They're aware this is an issue. The problem is that all of the dynamics of both culture and structure have been ratcheting down for some time. The space to do this, and have been ratcheting up the kind of the prompts to focus on efficiency and getting through the day. So we have a medical, I won't get into this in too much detail, but it's certainly the clinicians among you will understand. We have an electronic medical record that absorbs a huge amount of time and pulls our eyes from living beings to the computer. We have pressures on productivity, and we have a cultural emphasis on management of the machine through science and technology that keeps students, trained students, to think in terms of fixing the problem, knowing the data, being able to dissect the issue down to its constituent parts. And in that, it's hard to see the patient. It's hard to see the patient as a whole. It's hard to treat them as a person who's living out a history. It's hard to slow down and pay attention to how the pursuit of health for them needs to be accountable to who they are, who they're committed to, who their people are, what their hope is, what their vocation is. And I think medical educators we tell students how wonderful it is to speak to them, but then unfortunately we put them through what people have described as the intrinsic curriculum. The explicit curriculum says we just want you to listen and ask open-ended questions and spend lots of time. Then they get on the wards and they realize they're rewarded if they can knock things out, get stuff done, move people out of the hospital fast and effectively. And so it's a long answer to the question, but they're trying, but they're up against difficult odds.
One of the other things that's in the chat, just sort of going back to your previous statement from Dale Hamrick, one of our physicians who will speak to us in a couple of weeks, is sort of supporting, I think, some of what you just said, Dr. Curlin, that the key is having those conversations with family members.
Indeed.
He was speaking to some of those documents that you talked about, but that the critical thing is having those conversations.
And he also asked, is withdrawing ventilator support physician-assisted suicide? It's obviously a crucial question, and the answer is no, unless your point in withdrawing the ventilator is to get somebody dead. But that's not generally the reason why people withdraw ventilators. We withdraw ventilators because the ventilators no longer hold sufficient promise of restoring a significant measure of health to the person who's sick. It no longer looks like they're going to get better. It no longer looks like they're going to be able to live off the ventilator, or if they're able to live off the ventilator, they're not going to be able to live without further burdensome treatments, kind of just prolonging the dying process. And so from a Christian tradition standpoint, you have absolute freedom to stop anything that's not offering you proportionate benefit, including ventilators. And even when you know by doing so, you're going to hasten your death, even when you know you're going to die within minutes. We have that freedom, but we shouldn't be internally thinking something like, you know what, they could go on for the ventilator for a long time, but they don't want to be alive. So this would be a way to get them dead, which is what they really want. I don't think that's rarely the issue with withdrawing ventilators, but just something we should check ourselves. Is the goal of this to stop this burdensome treatment that's not really helping? It's freedom. Is the goal of this to get mom dead? so we can all move on with our lives, then at least stop and repent of that part and then ask the first question.
There's a couple more questions there. Somebody asked the practical question. This are sort of related. I'll offer these next two is, where do I find pulsed or most, I can't even say those acronyms well, form? Where would someone find that? And then the next question is your feelings about a DNR.
Yeah, so that you can get you look online and you can see the North Carolina forms. Just Google them, really. And then every hospital that you enter, a clinic, should have access to those. Every hospital will have, well, I should say, that's not true, actually. Some hospitals have decided not to cooperate in the most form. Duke, strangely, is one of them. We can offer people the forms, but we don't encourage that. And I can't remember all of the reasoning why. But you can find a most form in most healthcare institutions. You can find one online. Feelings about a DNR? Yeah, it's a great question. Just one of the strange parts of and strange accidents of the history of medicine in the United States is DNR has for a generation, really a half century, been the central way into conversations about limiting medicine at the end of life. And it's a terrible way in. Terrible insofar as it puts people on edge who don't need to be put on edge. People who are worried about having a DNR start feeling like people are trying to kill them. You see that a lot, and it often is just not the relevant issue. So a DNR order. So the default is, if you go in any hospital, this is true across the United States, and you start to die, unless you have a DNR form, attempts will be made to resuscitate you until those attempts fail. It doesn't matter if you're dying of stage 4 cancer, and where everybody knows this is not going to work. People are required to at least attempt to resuscitate you with heart compressions and ventilation and so on. And so when doctors start to sense, or sometimes when patients lead them to or beat them to this, but when they start to sense that a person might die and that resuscitation is not going to likely be very successful, then they start encouraging a DNR order. And I think when that comes up in the hospital, that's often a fitting thing to have, particularly if you have an advanced illness. I don't think it's a good idea for most people to have a DNR while you're living in the community. Like people on this call, unless you have advanced cancer, I wouldn't say have a DNR, because it confuses clinicians often. If you have a DNR order because you've decided, I don't want to be on a ventilator, and you show up in the emergency room with something that could potentially be handled in a matter of 2 or 3 days, like a pneumonia, and you might be right back to the life you have, doctors are going to start to think maybe they want to die. I don't understand that. Why do they have a DNR order? I guess we shouldn't ventilate them. So I think the DNR is helpful. To restate that, the DNR is helpful when you have a terminal illness, and then I think it's really fitting. Or you're in the hospital and declining in such a way that looks like you're not going to make it. It's fitting to have. I just don't think it's something that we want to push out prematurely.
So there's a few more related questions here in the chat. Question that says, Isn't it possible that a
DNR is simply a way to accept God's will without heroic measures when he would call the patient home? Yeah. I mean, the DNR, I think, is really fitting. It's a way of saying, if I put it this way, it's a way of saying, as a Christian, I know I'm going to die. And at this point, you've told me resuscitation offers me very little. Why would I ask you to do that? That seems like I'm desperately holding on to a life that I know I cannot hold on to. And so instead, I recognize I'm dying, and I trust that the Lord will raise me up, and I'm going to focus on, my vocation in light of that, not trying to stay alive. I do think that's appropriate in that case. I think Dale's also right to emphasize that these questions about limitations, including the DNR question, but I think more importantly, just conversation about what's important to you in how medicine is used as you grow frail or sick and come up against death, is important to have before you're in that situation, if at all possible.
Well, what other questions do any of you have? You could, yeah, Annie, I think I see your hands here.
Yes, it's not really a question. I wanted to actually share a story when Dr. Curlin was talking about the Alzheimer's issue earlier. My mother had it, and I would do as a regular routine with her when I would leave the benediction over her, the Lord bless you and keep you, and she would bow her head. And then when we would get done, I would say to her, would you like to pray anything? And she would never pray. But one time when we did it, she goes, Lord, I need you.
Wow.
And I remember you saying it. I knew God was with us.
Yeah.
That's just what I wanted to share. The other thing too was when people have Alzheimer's, and again, I'm only talking from personal experience. My mom ended up not dying of Alzheimer's. She died of sepsis. She had other complications. And I think that can happen a lot. You have one diagnosis. My dad had heart disease and thought he'd be taken out, with the heart, but that's not what got him. So a lot of times what you think you may die of isn't what you ultimately die of.
It's a very important point. And that's why I was emphasizing the durable power of attorney for healthcare. We really have very little ability to predict what you're going to die of or when you're going to die. It's one of the kind of dirty little secrets that's a huge issue in medicine, is that whereas we're very good at taking care of you when you are sick, I mean, relative to historical standards, when you are sick, we can quickly figure out what's going on in most cases and do stuff to be helpful. But keeping you from getting sick or from having a heart attack or from having a stroke or from getting cancer, we're just not very good at that. If you put all of our screening together and all of our meds and all of our blood pressure control and all of our cholesterol and everything, all of it just only very modestly adjusts what's going to happen. When Jesus says in Matthew 6, who of you by being anxious can add a single hour to his life? He was saying something important spiritually, but he's also saying something quite practical that remains today. There's just not a lot of control. And so we have to live with a heart of faith, trusting God, and again, trusting one another to care for each other.
Thank you.
We only have a couple more minutes left with Dr. Curlin, and there's lots of things that have come in the chat, some of those to everyone. One of those things I thought I would maybe highlight. She says, it's not really a question, but she says, fighting as hard as you can up to the very end is so celebrated in our society. And then her personal comment is, I'm not sure how I feel about that, but I don't want my children to remember me as a quitter. I just thought that was another really important issue we haven't really touched on yet.
I get that. And a lot of people feel that way. I mean, I think it raises the question, what are you fighting for? Which goes back to the beginning of our vocation as a disciple of Jesus Christ. The challenge for us is to discern, Lord, what is it I should struggle for? And sometimes you should struggle through cooperation with medicine to stay alive and to get better. And sometimes it'll be clear, and this takes being in a community, formation, pastoring to help us through this. But sometimes the challenge is not that instead you want to fight for. You're not going to quit, but what you're going to fight for in the final days is not to stay alive, because that's not a battle that's worth fighting in many cases. But I'm going to fight to bless my children. I'm going to fight to give thanks to God to the end and bear witness to the faith that I hope that my kids will continue to have. I'm going to fight to encourage others. I'm going to fight to wrap my affairs up in a way that people receive as a blessing, whatever it might be. You can fight without fighting to stay alive. against odds that make that fight kind of not make much sense.
Thank you. We've only got like another minute, so I'm not sure we have enough time for a question, but I said to a few folks that were in this at the very beginning, if you haven't seen, there's a Frontline, about an hour-long movie that features Dr. Gawande and some of the themes. And one of the patients that's featured there, I think, is an excellent example for me of what Dr. Curlin was just talking about. He made some very intentional decisions with his wife and his medical team at the end, and they interview him. It ends up being only hours before he dies, and he says, "These have been the best weeks of my life because I've been surrounded by my family and my friends." The movie features him having this conversation with one of his grandchildren. Those kinds of conversations that I think we all know are incredibly hard, but to me, incredibly profound and incredibly important. I think particularly
Kathy,
for people of faith.
Your story there leads me to, I want to say one last thing to you, a parting word, which is when you get sick, many of you are going to impulsively feel like, I don't want people to visit. And I just encourage you to push against that. I've been taking care of people for 20 years who are dying and watched hundreds and hundreds of people die. And I think this is a impulse that comes out of our culture in a way that does not fit with who the church is. So I just encourage you to let yourself be embarrassed by how weak you are. Let people come in and touch you and love you and weep over you and sing songs to you and tell you how much you meant to them, and feel awkward. Let them feel awkward about how they don't know what to say, and just let people come in. That's parting word.
Thank you. And my pastoral message would be exactly the same. I think that is critically important. And the end of that video just highlighted that so incredibly beautifully for me. I was just imagining how blessed that grandchild's life was to have sat at his grandfather's bed and had those conversations.
Yeah.
As hard as it was for both of them. So beautiful. Well, thank you so much. I know there's been lots of messages in the chat thanking you. People have done their applause hands in the screen. We are so grateful for your willingness to spend this time with us, Dr. Curlin, and to share not only as a physician, but as a deeply committed person of faith. That's why we're having this conversation in the churches, because we are people of faith and followers of Jesus, and that should be a central part of how we approach everything. Absolutely. Including our health and our death. And so thank you so much for starting us off in such a wonderful place.
You're welcome.
We will be back again, the rest of you, and anyone else who you want to have join. We'll again next Sunday morning. Melanie Childers, who is the chaplain at the hospital in Boone, will be with us to share from her experience and her perspective. So we look forward to continuing this conversation next week. And the following week, Dale Hamrick, who's put lots of questions in the chat for us this morning, he'll be presenting for us. So I hope that we'll see you again next week. And thank you. Please join me in thanking Dr. Curlin.
Goodbye, you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And all of you are welcome to stay on if you'd like to. Coffee and conversation continues now and for about another 15 or 20 minutes. And so you're welcome to stay on if you'd like to chat about what we've just been talking about, or